The mist lay heavy over the old cemetery in the early hours, wrapping around the gravestones like a shroud. Marina, her frail form hunched and weary, knelt at her son's grave, whispering soft words into the silence. It was a ritual she repeated every morning, clinging to memories, her voice swallowed by the stillness around her. Her hand, calloused and trembling, brushed across Lucas's name, carved into the stone. She spoke to him in murmurs, reminiscing about days long gone, her memories interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Each word was both a comfort and a reminder of the painful void he left behind. She had buried her only son, her only family, and now all she had were these whispered conversations with the cold ground. The faint hum of a car engine broke the stillness. Marina looked up just in time to see a sleek, black car glide down the cemetery road. It came to a stop near the entrance, and from it stepped Vivian, her late son's widow. With her immaculate coat and expensive handbag, Vivian was a picture of elegance and wealth, everything that Marina was not. Marina watched as Vivian approached the grave without a single glance in her direction. There was a distance between them that went beyond physical space. Marina, in her worn coat and sensible shoes, rooted to the ground, and Vivian, in her designer attire, heels tapping against the path. She stood there briefly, her expression impassive, before turning on her heel and heading back to her car, her shoulders squared in a way that seemed almost triumphant. The brief interaction, or lack thereof, left Marina hollow. To Vivian, this place was nothing more than an obligation, a duty she fulfilled with as much warmth as a cold wind. But for Marina, this was sacred ground. She couldn't help but wonder if Vivian had ever truly loved Lucas. She wondered if there was more to her son's death than she had been told. As the sound of Vivian's car faded into the distance, Marina remained by the grave, her thoughts swirling with memories and suspicions. She clutched the edges of her worn coat and turned back to the stone, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I'll find out what really happened to you, Lucas. I swear it." Returning home later that morning, Marina settled into Lucas's old room, which she had barely touched since his death. It was a modest room, lined with bookshelves and a small desk, just as he'd left it. The air held his scent, and she could almost feel his presence lingering in the quiet spaces. Her fingers trailed across his belongings, touching each item like it was part of him. She opened a drawer to find old photos and letters, remnants of a simpler time. The memories brought both comfort and pain, but something caught her attention. A small, worn notebook wedged at the back of the drawer, almost hidden. She pulled it out carefully, her breath hitching as she realized it was a diary, Lucas's diary. Her hands shook as she opened it, her eyes scanning the first few entries. At first, it seemed like a regular journal, with mundane accounts of his daily life. But as she read further, her heart tightened. Lucas had written about struggles in his marriage, his words filled with frustration and a hint of fear. The entries became darker over time, with notes about Vivian's controlling behavior and accusations he never dared to voice aloud. He'd expressed regret and confusion, and in one chilling entry, he'd written, "I feel like I'm a stranger in my own home. I don't know if I can keep living like this." Marina's eyes filled with tears, a sickening realization settling in. This wasn't just about grief. This was about something darker. She read through each page, her heart breaking with every line. Lucas had hidden this pain from her, kept these fears to himself. It was almost as if he had been trapped, and Vivian had been the one tightening the bars around him. One particular entry left her frozen. It was dated a few weeks before his death. "I need to find a way out. I'm scared of what she'll do if she finds out what I've been planning. I have to be careful." The words were like a dagger, a final message from Lucas, begging for someone to hear him. Marina clutched the diary to her chest, her mind racing. Why had her son been so afraid? What had he planned? And why had he never told her? She felt a surge of determination course through her veins. This was no longer just about mourning. It was about justice. She would get to the bottom of what had happened to her son. And if Vivian held any answers, She would find them, no matter the cost. Marina stepped out of her house the next morning, gripping Lucas's diary in her hand as though it were a lifeline. The diary's words haunted her, fueling her with a mix of sorrow and anger. Lucas had been trapped, his suffering hidden behind the walls of his own home. She felt an overwhelming need to speak to someone, anyone, who might have known what was happening beneath the surface of his marriage. She made her way to the center of town, a small cluster of old buildings and narrow streets, where everyone knew everyone else's business. Marina could feel the curious glances from passers-by, people who once offered condolences, now watching her with wary eyes. She stopped at the local cafe, where she hoped to find someone willing to speak about Lucas. Inside, she saw Mrs. Alvarez, an elderly woman who had known Lucas since he was a child. Marina approached her, forcing a polite smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Alvarez," she said, her voice steady. Mrs. Alvarez gave her a cautious look. "Good morning, Marina," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. Marina took a seat beside her. "I wanted to ask, did Lucas ever mention anything to you? Anything about his marriage?" The old woman shifted uncomfortably. "Lucas was a quiet boy, always polite. But I never liked that woman, Vivian. She's too flashy, too distant. It's as if she looks down on us all." She lowered her voice. "But no, dear, Lucas never said anything to me directly." Disheartened, Marina continued her search, speaking to others who had known her son. She visited old friends, family acquaintances, anyone who might have noticed signs of strain in Lucas's life. Yet no one offered much information. The whole town seemed to be either avoiding her or unwilling to cross Vivian's invisible boundary of influence. As the day wore on, Marina felt an oppressive weight settle over her. The townsfolk who once welcomed her were now avoiding her, and even those she trusted hesitated to speak about Lucas. Marina realized Vivian's influence stretched far beyond her immediate circle, reaching into the very fabric of the town. Returning home, Marina felt the sting of isolation anew. She was an outsider in her own community, a grieving mother ignored by those who once offered comfort. But as she sat in her quiet house, Lucas's diary beside her, she knew she couldn't give up. Her son's words were her only guide, and she resolved to continue, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. The following day, Marina decided to visit Raphael, Lucas's closest friend since childhood. If anyone would have known what was happening in her son's life, it would be Raphael. She found him at his workshop, tucked away at the edge of town, where he crafted furniture with his hands and a keen eye for detail. "Marina," Raphael said with a warm but cautious smile as she entered. He motioned her to sit, and she noticed his hesitation, as though he'd been waiting for this conversation. "I need to know, Raphael," Marina said, her voice breaking. "I need to know what happened to Lucas. He was afraid and he didn't tell me. But he told you, didn't he?" Raphael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Marina, Lucas was my best friend. He loved you, and he didn't want you to worry. That's why he kept things quiet. But yes, he confided in me about Vivian." He hesitated, clearly struggling with his words. Vivian was controlling. She had this way of twisting his words, making him feel trapped. He thought about leaving, but what? Marina pressed, feeling her heart race. He was scared, Raphael admitted, his eyes meeting hers with a pained expression. Vivian had ways of making him feel like he was nothing without her. He talked about gathering evidence, proof that she was, well, not who she seemed. He wanted to leave, but he didn't know if he could. Marina felt a mix of relief and despair. She wasn't alone in this knowledge. Someone else had seen her son's suffering. "Did he ever say what kind of evidence?" she asked, desperate for any hint that could lead her closer to the truth. Raphael shook his head. "Not exactly, but he was thorough, Marina. He wouldn't have just left it lying around. If he kept something, he hid it somewhere safe. Maybe somewhere in town." Marina's mind raced. She remembered the notes and receipts she'd found in Lucas's belongings, seemingly random details that now took on a new significance. Lucas had been careful, methodical. If he had hidden something, it was likely somewhere she hadn't thought to look. "Thank you, Raphael," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I'll find it. Whatever he left behind, I'll find it." As she left Raphael's workshop, Marina felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lucas had trusted Raphael enough to share his fears, and now she had another thread to follow. She would search through the town, looking in places he frequented, seeking out any clue he might have left behind. With each step she took, Marina felt closer to Lucas, as though she were retracing his steps, piecing together the puzzle he'd left for her. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew she wouldn't stop until she found the truth. Marina woke early, her mind fixated on Lucas's diary entries and Raphael's words. If her son had hidden evidence in town, she would have to retrace his steps and check every place he might have left a clue. She gathered the receipts and odd notes she'd found, studying each one carefully. Some were from local shops and restaurants. Others seemed to correspond to specific dates. Marina wondered if each of these locations held a part of the truth Lucas had been desperate to conceal. Her first stop was the Cornerstone Cafe, a small diner Lucas had frequented. The staff remembered him, especially Marta, a long-time waitress who had served him often. Marina approached her, hoping for some insight. "Marta," she began hesitantly, "I know this is strange, but did Lucas ever mention anything to you? Anything about feeling afraid or unhappy?" Marta hesitated, her face clouded with a mixture of sympathy and reluctance. "He was a kind soul, your Lucas," she said softly. "But there was a heaviness about him, especially in those last few months. I remember he'd sit there for hours, just staring at his coffee. He didn't talk much, but when he did, there was a sadness in his eyes." As Marina listened, a thought occurred to her. Did he ever leave anything here? A notebook? A letter? Anything? Marta shook her head. "No, but he did keep a small locker in the back room. Some customers keep things here if they're regulars. I can show you." Marina followed Marta to the back, where she unlocked a small, dusty cabinet. Inside was a box labeled with Lucas's name. With trembling hands, Marina opened it to find a collection of notebooks, receipts, and a few photographs of her son, looking solemn and thoughtful. Among the items was a small envelope, sealed and unmarked. Marina pocketed it, her heart racing. Thanking Marta, she left the cafe, feeling a mixture of dread and hope. She opened the envelope as soon as she was outside, unfolding a single sheet of paper. It was a letter in Lucas's handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you in person. I kept things hidden, but I was gathering proof of everything. Proof of how she controlled me, how she manipulated every part of my life. I know it's dangerous, but I can't live in this lie any longer. Mother, if anything happens to me, find the rest. They're where we went that summer. The place you always said was our little secret." The words hit Marina like a wave. Lucas had entrusted her with this, knowing she would understand the hidden message. She remembered the spot instantly, an old, overgrown clearing on the outskirts of town where they had spent many summer afternoons when Lucas was a child. It was a place they'd never told anyone about, a secret they'd shared. Taking a deep breath, Marina made her way there, following the winding path through the trees, her steps filled with a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow. When she reached the clearing, she began to search, pushing aside leaves and stones until her fingers brushed something cold and metallic. She pulled out a small, locked box, its surface worn with age. In her heart, she knew this box held the answers she sought. She would need to find a way to open it. She returned home, her mind racing with the possibilities of what Lucas might have hidden inside. With Lucas's message fresh in her mind and the locked box in her possession, Marina felt a surge of determination she hadn't felt in years. She needed answers, and there was one person who might know more than she let on: Vivian. Marina hadn't stepped foot in Vivian's lavish estate since her son's funeral. The grand stone structure loomed over her as she approached, the chill of the autumn air biting into her skin. She steadied herself, willing her emotions to remain in check, and knocked on the heavy door. After a few moments, Vivian opened the door, her expression one of mild irritation. "Marina, she said, her tone cold. To what do I owe the pleasure? Without waiting for an invitation, Marina stepped inside. We need to talk, Vivian. About Lucas. Vivian's eyebrows arched, but she didn't object. Instead, she led Marina into a sitting room where she settled gracefully on a plush sofa, watching Marina with a detached curiosity. I don't see what there is to discuss, Vivian said, her voice smooth. He's gone. That's the end of it. No, Marina said firmly, taking a seat across from her. I know what you did to him. I know about the control, the manipulation. Lucas was afraid of you, Vivian. He kept it hidden, but I know. A flicker of something, anger, perhaps, passed across Vivian's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She smiled, a condescending smile that made Marina's skin crawl. And what are you going to do with this information? Vivian asked, her tone mocking. You have nothing to prove any of it. Marina held up the lockbox. This was his. He hid it from you, just as he tried to hide his pain. And I'll open it, Vivian. I'll find out what he left behind. Vivian's face hardened. Whatever fantasy you're clinging to, it won't change anything, Marina. Lucas was weak, always looking for someone to blame. If he had issues, they were his alone. Marina felt her composure slip, anger bubbling to the surface. How dare you, she whispered, her voice shaking. You took my son from me. Whatever you did to him, whatever fear you instilled in him, I won't let you get away with it. Vivian laughed, a low, cruel sound that echoed through the room. Marina, you're grasping at shadows. Lucas is gone. No amount of finger-pointing will bring him back. Marina stood, clutching the box to her chest. I'll find the truth, Vivian. And when I do, you'll be the one left in the shadows. Turning on her heel, Marina left the estate, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Vivian's mocking laughter echoed in her mind as she walked away, but it only fueled her resolve. Lucas had left her a trail of breadcrumbs, and she would follow it to the end. After the tense confrontation with Vivian, Marina found herself both energized and deeply disturbed. She could still hear Vivian's mocking laughter, her cold dismissal of Lucas's pain. She realized that Vivian's influence over the town was stronger than she had anticipated, an invisible web woven through years of power and wealth. But Marina refused to let that silence her. She returned to the town, box in hand, and began speaking with people, hoping someone would confirm her suspicions about Vivian. But word of her search had already spread, and people were more guarded than ever. At the local grocery store, familiar faces turned away when they saw her. Conversations quieted as she approached, and even old friends seemed reluctant to meet her gaze. One afternoon, she encountered Mr. Lopez, an old family friend. She hoped his loyalty to Lucas's memory would outweigh any fear of Vivian. Mr. Lopez, please, she whispered, desperation coloring her voice. Lucas was in trouble. You knew him well. Didn't you notice anything? Mr. Lopez shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around. Marina, I'm sorry. But this town, people don't like to get involved in things that aren't their business. Vivian has a way of. He trailed off, clearly fearful of crossing that invisible line. Marina pressed on, despite his reluctance. This isn't just gossip, Mr. Lopez. Lucas was suffering, and I know she had something to do with it. Doesn't he deserve justice? Mr. Lopez hesitated, casting a wary glance around before lowering his voice. Marina, there are things about Vivian people don't want to talk about. Strange things. You might be right, but no one's going to cross her. She's untouchable, at least to most folks here. As Marina walked away, frustration bubbled within her. The town she once considered a supportive community was now silent, complicit. Vivian's shadow loomed over every interaction, every closed door. But even as her isolation grew, her determination strengthened. She would find out the truth, even if the entire town turned against her. Returning home that evening, Marina examined the locked box once more, feeling the weight of Lucas's hidden secrets. She was closer than ever, and with each passing day, her resolve deepened. If Vivian controlled the town, Then Marina would have to rely on herself to finish what her son had started. A few days later, Marina decided to take a closer look at the lockbox. She visited a locksmith, hoping to open it without damaging whatever might be inside. After a bit of work, the locksmith pried the box open, revealing a neat stack of letters. Marina's hands trembled as she lifted the first envelope, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. Each letter was addressed to a woman named Sarah, a name she didn't recognize. She started reading, piecing together a story of trust and vulnerability that Lucas had shared with this unknown confidant. The letters revealed how he had grown to trust Sarah with secrets he couldn't share with anyone else, especially not Vivian. He described feeling isolated, expressing doubts about his marriage, and a growing fear that he was losing control of his life. One letter caught her attention. Dated only a month before his death, Lucas wrote, "Sarah, I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up. Vivian's moods are unpredictable. One moment, she's sweet and loving, and the next, she's cold and distant. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells, and it's only getting worse. I can't talk to anyone here. They're all either afraid of her or too dazzled by her to see the truth. You're the only one who listens. I've started gathering proof of the things she's done. If anything happens to me, promise you'll tell someone." The words sent a shiver down Marina's spine. Her son had been terrified, trapped in a life he couldn't escape, and this woman, Sarah, had been his lifeline. Marina felt an overwhelming gratitude toward the stranger who had offered her son comfort when he had no one else to turn to. But who was Sarah, and where could she be now? Marina needed to find her, to understand the full extent of what Lucas had confided. She returned to the locksmith, who allowed her to make copies of the letters in case the originals were lost or damaged. Determined, Marina began asking around town, starting with some of Lucas's old friends. Eventually, she got a lead from a mutual friend who had once seen Lucas and a woman he didn't recognize in the next town over. The description matched what Marina imagined Sarah might look like, and she decided to follow the lead. In the neighboring town, Marina finally tracked down Sarah's address. When Sarah opened the door, her face was a mixture of shock and sadness, as though she had been expecting this visit, yet dreading it all the same. "You're Lucas's mother," she said softly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Marina nodded, unable to speak. They sat together in Sarah's small living room, the silence heavy with shared grief. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Lucas was a good man. He was so lost in that marriage. I tried to help him, but I knew it wasn't enough. Vivian was like a shadow over him, always watching." Marina listened, feeling a kinship with this woman who had seen Lucas's pain as clearly as she did. Sarah handed over a small notebook Lucas had entrusted to her, a journal filled with observations, dates, and specific instances of Vivian's controlling behavior. "He asked me to keep this safe," Sarah explained, her voice breaking, "in case he couldn't get away." Marina took the journal, her heart heavy. She finally had concrete evidence, but at a devastating cost. She knew that this would be enough to begin confronting Vivian directly, to challenge her hold on the town. But she also knew that what lay ahead would be difficult. Vivian was powerful, and this journey was far from over. As she left Sarah's house, Marina felt the weight of her son's struggles press down on her. But with the journal in her possession, she now had the means to expose the truth. It was a bittersweet victory. Lucas was gone, but his voice would not be silenced. Armed with Lucas's journal and the letters he had entrusted to Sarah, Marina felt more confident. She now had concrete evidence of the pain her son had endured and the oppressive control Vivian had exercised over him. But she also knew that to truly expose the truth, she would need help. Marina decided to confide in a few trusted people, hoping they might help spread the truth about Vivian's cruelty and influence. She began with Father Miguel, the town's priest, who had known Lucas since he was a child. She handed him the journal and letters, her voice barely a whisper, as she explained everything she had discovered. Father Miguel's face grew pale as he read the words Lucas had left behind. "Marina," he murmured, crossing himself, "this is heartbreaking. Lucas never deserved this. I will stand by you, but you must know that going up against Vivian will be difficult. She has the town's loyalty, and many will be afraid to challenge her. Marina nodded, steeling herself. I know, Father, but I can't let her memory overshadow Lucas's truth. He deserves justice. Encouraged by Father Miguel's support, Marina reached out to a few more people, including Isabel, an old family friend, and Carlos, a town official who had once been close to her family. She met with them in private, carefully choosing her words, emphasizing the need for caution. But while Isabel responded with sympathy and promised to spread the word discreetly, Carlos's reaction was different. He listened to her story in silence, his expression unreadable, but Marina could sense a hesitation in his eyes. A few days later, Marina began hearing whispers around town. Someone had betrayed her confidence, and word of her investigation had reached Vivian. Marina realized, with a sinking heart, that Carlos had likely told her. Suddenly, people were colder than ever, their gazes wary, and whispers followed her wherever she went. One afternoon, Vivian confronted her in the street. You think you can turn this town against me? Vivian sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. You're just a grieving old woman, Marina. No one believes your wild accusations. Marina held her ground, though her hands trembled. People will see the truth, Vivian. They'll see who you really are. Vivian smirked, undeterred. You're playing a dangerous game. Keep this up, and you'll regret it. She turned and strode away, leaving Marina standing alone, her resolve shaken. The betrayal stung deeply. Marina had hoped that Carlos would help, that he would remember Lucas's kindness, but instead, he had aligned himself with Vivian, likely to secure his own position. Marina realized she would need to be even more cautious moving forward. Vivian was aware of her every move, and it was clear that she would stop at nothing to maintain her control. Returning home that night, Marina felt the weight of loneliness settle over her once again. But as she looked at Lucas's journal, she felt a renewed determination. Even if the town turned against her, she would continue her fight. Lucas had endured so much, and she would not let his story be forgotten. As the days passed, the consequences of Carlos's betrayal became clear. The townspeople who once welcomed Marina now avoided her entirely, some even crossing the street to avoid speaking with her. Those she had hoped to rally against Vivian had either been swayed by her influence or were too afraid to oppose her openly. Marina began to feel trapped, hemmed in by the town's silence. Every glance felt accusatory, every whisper seemed directed at her. She was stranger in the place she had called home her entire life. She could see that Vivian's manipulation had worked, turning the community against her, isolating her further with each passing day. One evening, Marina sat alone at her kitchen table, the silence pressing down on her. She stared at Lucas's journal, flipping through the pages, reading his words again and again, as if they could somehow bring her son back. The memories were painful, and for the first time since she began this journey, she questioned whether she had the strength to continue. As she reread one of Lucas's final letters to Sarah, her hands began to shake. The words seemed heavier now, laced with a despair that mirrored her own. I don't know how to escape this. I feel like every choice I make only pulls me deeper into her web. I'm so tired, Sarah. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Marina felt the tears spill over, her chest tight with grief. She missed her son so deeply that it ached, and the realization that he had suffered so much alone tore at her heart. She had promised herself that she would uncover the truth, but in that moment, with the town against her and Vivian's threats hanging over her, she felt defeated. For hours, she sat in silence, the weight of her loss pressing down on her. Her heart felt hollow, her mind clouded with doubts. She wondered if it was worth it, if her struggle would only serve to tarnish her son's memory rather than honor it. But as the night wore on, a sense of calm settled over her. Marina thought of Lucas, of his quiet resilience, his kind heart. She remembered how he had always tried to protect her, even in his final days, hiding his suffering so she wouldn't worry. and she realized that giving up now would be a betrayal of everything he had endured. Slowly, she rose, the darkness in her heart giving way to a renewed resolve. She would not let Vivian's cruelty erase Lucas's memory. She would press on, even if it meant standing alone. The night was long, but by morning, Marina felt a sense of clarity. She was ready to face whatever came next, prepared to fight until her last breath, if that's what it took to bring the truth to light. The dawn brought a new clarity to Marina. After her darkest night, she emerged with a hardened resolve. The isolation and rejection she felt from the town only deepened her determination. She realized that her fight wasn't only for Lucas, but for herself as well. She needed to restore her own faith, to stand up for the love and memory of her son. Marina decided to go back to the evidence she gathered, poring over every word in Lucas's letters and journal. She needed something that would convince the townspeople of Vivian's cruelty, something they couldn't ignore. She carefully arranged all of the documents, examining them as if Lucas himself were guiding her hands. Suddenly, an idea struck her. The letters Lucas had written to Sarah were dated, revealing a clear timeline of escalating threats and emotional manipulation. If she could present them in a way that exposed Vivian's actions without directly accusing her, perhaps she could start swaying people's opinions. Marina went to Father Miguel, sharing her plan. He agreed to help, suggesting they discreetly distribute copies of Lucas's letters to a few trusted townspeople, people who still had influence and weren't fully under Vivian's sway. They need to see the truth in Lucas's own words, he said gently, patting Marina's hand. Over the next few days, they worked together, making copies of the letters and slipping them into the hands of carefully chosen allies. Little by little, murmurs began to rise in town. People were reading Lucas's words and starting to question the image Vivian had so carefully cultivated. Marina saw the change in people's eyes as they passed her on the street. Some avoided her, but others looked at her with sympathy or even admiration. Her spirits lifted, knowing that the truth was beginning to seep through. Vivian's power wasn't as unbreakable as it seemed. Marina felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, a glimmer of hope that the truth would win out in the end. With every letter distributed, every whisper of doubt, she could feel Lucas's memory becoming stronger, his voice finally heard. One evening, as Marina walked through town, she was approached by Elena, a young woman who had been friends with Lucas. She had seen the letters and wanted to help. "There's something you should know," Elena said in a hushed tone, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Lucas came to me once, a few months before he passed. He was so distressed, talking about things he couldn't tell anyone else. He mentioned a place, a hidden spot where he left some papers, just in case." The words struck a chord with Marina. Lucas had been careful, methodical. She had found clues he'd left behind before. Now she felt there might be one final piece she hadn't uncovered. Following Elena's hint, Marina searched through every part of town where Lucas might have hidden something. She returned to places they had visited together, retracing the steps they had once shared. In the far corner of an old abandoned shed they had played in when Lucas was young, she finally found a weathered metal box. Inside was a stack of documents revealing Vivian's financial transactions, letters to suspicious contacts, and evidence of her manipulative dealings with the town's influential figures. Lucas had somehow managed to collect this information, documenting each instance where Vivian used her wealth and power to her advantage, controlling the lives of those around her. The papers were damning, casting a light on Vivian's true nature in a way that couldn't be ignored. Marina's heart pounded as she absorbed the information. She now had proof that could dismantle Vivian's reputation, exposing her not only as a manipulative widow, but as someone who had exploited the community for her own gain. She knew, however, that exposing these papers would come with a cost. Vivian would retaliate, and Marina needed to be prepared for the fight of her life. Armed with the documents, Marina returned to Father Miguel, who offered his unwavering support. "This is enough," he assured her. "With this, the town will see the truth." Together, they organized a meeting, inviting some of the town's most respected members. Marina presented the evidence, speaking passionately about her son's suffering and how Vivian had manipulated him and the entire town. The weight of Lucas's story, coupled with the incriminating documents, was enough to sway even the most loyal supporters of Vivian. As the meeting ended, Marina felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The tide was turning, and people were beginning to see Vivian for who she truly was. It was the first true victory in her long journey, and for the first time since Lucas's death, Marina felt a sense of peace. With the evidence in hand and support building, Marina felt a powerful sense of momentum. The town's whispers had turned into conversations, and people were beginning to question the image they'd held of Vivian for so long. But she knew that if she wanted to bring lasting change, she needed to go public with everything. Father Miguel suggested they hold a town gathering in the community hall, inviting everyone to hear the truth. Marina agreed, knowing that facing the entire community would be daunting, but it was the only way to clear Lucas's name and unveil Vivian's manipulation once and for all. The evening of the gathering arrived. Marina stood at the front of the hall, her hands gripping Lucas's journal and the stack of documents. The room was filled with familiar faces, many of whom had avoided her in recent weeks. She saw Vivian standing near the back, her face a mask of icy disdain. Taking a deep breath, Marina began to speak. She described Lucas's struggles, his quiet pain, and the signs he had hidden from everyone but his closest confidants. Her voice trembled but remained steady as she recounted the entries in his journal, detailing his fear and feelings of entrapment in his marriage. Then, she presented the documents, pointing out Vivian's calculated moves to control Lucas and her hidden influence over the town. As she spoke, she could see the shift in people's faces. Many looked shocked, others horrified, but most appeared conflicted. Vivian's influence had been strong, and Marina knew it would take more than just words to break the illusion completely. Finally, Marina held up the letters Lucas had written to Sarah, his last attempt to reach out. "These are my son's words," she said, her voice breaking. He was asking for help. He knew what was happening, and he was trapped. He trusted me to tell his story, to make sure the truth wasn't buried with him. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Marina could see the weight of her words settling on the townspeople. She glanced at Vivian, whose face had turned pale, her grip tightening on the back of a chair. Vivian's cold mask was beginning to crack. One by one, townspeople began to stand and speak, expressing their shock and betrayal. Some voiced their regrets, admitting they had ignored signs or dismissed Lucas's pain. The people who had once turned away from Marina were now rallying around her, seeing the truth that had been hidden for so long. Vivian, unable to bear the shift in opinion, tried to defend herself, her voice sharp and dismissive. "This is all nonsense," she cried. "You can't seriously believe this woman's ramblings. She's just a grieving mother, desperate to make someone else responsible for her son's choices." But the evidence was too overwhelming. Marina's testimony, the letters, and the documents painted a picture that was undeniable. The crowd turned on Vivian, murmuring in disgust and anger. The trust she had once wielded with ease had been shattered, replaced with a sense of betrayal that no amount of charm could repair. As the meeting drew to a close, Marina felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The town had finally seen the truth, and Lucas's story was no longer hidden in the shadows. Vivian's control was broken, her reputation in tatters. The morning after the gathering, Marina decided to visit Lucas's grave. She felt an overwhelming need to speak to him, to tell him that his story had been told, his suffering acknowledged. She made her way through the mist-laden cemetery, her steps light with the knowledge that she had finally fulfilled her promise. As she approached the grave, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Vivian, her face a mix of rage and desperation. "You think you've won, don't you?" Vivian hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed anger. "You think these people will stand by you now, that they'll believe your lies forever?" Marina took a steadying breath, meeting Vivian's gaze. "It's not about winning, Vivian. It's about the truth. Lucas deserved to have his story heard, and now he has. You can't control this town any longer." Vivian's eyes blazed with fury. You ruined everything. My life, my reputation. All because you couldn't accept that your son was weak. Marina's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. Lucas wasn't weak. He was kind, gentle, and he loved you, despite everything. He didn't deserve what you did to him. Vivian laughed bitterly. Love? You think he loved me? He was just a burden, clinging to me because he had nowhere else to go. I gave him everything, and he couldn't even handle that. Marina's hands clenched. She could feel Lucas's pain in every cruel word Vivian spoke. You twisted his love, used it to keep him trapped. But no more, Vivian. The town sees you for who you are now. You can't hurt him anymore. Vivian took a step closer, her voice a venomous whisper. You may think you're rid of me, but this isn't over, Marina. You've only made things worse for yourself. You've lost your son, and soon you'll lose everything else. But Marina stood her ground, unshaken. I have already lost everything, and there's nothing you can take from me now that will hurt me more than what I've already endured. Lucas is free from you, and so am I. With one last glare, Vivian turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the mist. Marina watched her go, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. Vivian's threats no longer held any power over her. She had faced her, seen the true depths of her cruelty, and emerged stronger for it. Marina knelt by Lucas's grave, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "You're free now, Lucas. You don't have to carry this burden anymore. I'll keep your memory alive, as it should be." As the sun rose, casting light over the cemetery, Marina felt a profound sense of closure. She had kept her promise, brought Lucas's truth to light, and reclaimed his story from the shadows. The past no longer held her captive, and with that realization, she rose to face a future filled with peace and resilience. The day after the confrontation at the cemetery, Marina noticed a shift in the town's atmosphere. Word had spread quickly about the gathering, and it was clear that Vivian's reputation was in ruins. She no longer held the quiet power that had once made people fear her. Instead, she was met with cold stares and whispers whenever she ventured outside. For years, Vivian had controlled the town through intimidation and manipulation, but now, people saw her for who she truly was. Marina continued her quiet routine, feeling the weight of grief still upon her, but with a new sense of peace. She had fulfilled her promise to Lucas. She had told his story, cleared his name, and freed both herself and her son from Vivian's shadow. She knew that Lucas would have wanted her to move on, to reclaim her life without the burden of anger or bitterness. One morning, as Marina visited the market, she saw Vivian at a distance, surrounded by a group of townspeople who once would have been loyal to her. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces a mix of sympathy and contempt. Vivian's usual proud stance was gone. She seemed smaller, almost invisible among the very people who once admired her. Later that day, Sheriff Alvarez visited Marina's home. He was a longtime friend of the family, and his face was solemn as he sat across from her, hat in hand. "Marina, I wanted you to know that we're investigating Lucas's case more closely," he said gently. "The evidence you provided, well, it's enough to warrant a deeper look into the circumstances around his death." Marina nodded, her heart both heavy and relieved. She had never imagined this outcome when she'd begun her journey, but she was grateful that justice, even if delayed, was being served. In the following weeks, Vivian became a virtual outcast. The town that had once adored her now kept her at arm's length, avoiding her gaze and refusing her once welcome presence at social gatherings. Marina watched quietly, her heart finally at ease. Vivian's influence was gone, her reputation dismantled by the very community she had once controlled. As Marina continued her life, she found comfort in the everyday moments she had once overlooked. The warmth of a neighbor's greeting, the laughter of children in the park, the simple beauty of her garden. Lucas's memory lingered, but it no longer weighed her down. Instead, it felt like a gentle presence, a reminder of love that could never be destroyed. Months passed, and Marina's life began to settle into a new normal. She still visited Lucas's grave regularly, but her visits were no longer filled with grief and unanswered questions. Instead, she brought fresh flowers and spoke softly to him, sharing her days, her hopes, and even the small joys she'd rediscovered. She knew Lucas would be at peace, knowing his mother had honored his memory and found strength in her journey. One afternoon, Marina received a letter in the mail from Sarah. In the letter, Sarah expressed her admiration for Marina's courage and strength, thanking her for bringing Lucas's truth to light. She mentioned that she was moving to a nearby town and invited Marina to visit. It was a gesture of friendship and healing, a reminder that she was not alone in her memories of Lucas. Feeling the warmth of Sarah's words, Marina decided to take her up on the invitation. A few days later, she made the journey, feeling a sense of excitement that she hadn't felt in years. Sarah welcomed her with open arms, and they spent hours sharing stories, both joyful and painful, about Lucas. Their shared memories allowed them to laugh and grieve together, a cathartic experience that lifted a weight from Marina's heart. As they sat together, Sarah spoke softly. "Lucas was lucky to have you as a mother. He knew how much you loved him, and I believe he found strength in that love, even in his darkest days." Marina smiled, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. Knowing he wasn't completely alone in those days, it means more to me than you can imagine." On her journey home, Marina felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known since Lucas's passing. The loneliness that had once haunted her was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. She realized that her life wasn't over. It was simply beginning a new chapter, one where Lucas's memory would live on through her actions and her renewed joy in life. Back in town, she noticed the impact her journey had on the community. People greeted her warmly, and neighbors who had once been silent began stopping by to visit. Marina had become a symbol of resilience and truth, a testament to the power of love and courage. She embraced her role, offering a kind ear to those in need and quietly encouraging others to speak their truths, no matter the consequences. The final time she visited Lucas's grave, Marina felt only peace. She placed a single white lily on the ground, her fingers grazing the earth as she whispered her farewell. "Thank you, Lucas, for giving me the strength to carry on. I'll live a life you'd be proud of. I promise." As she left the cemetery, Marina felt the weight of her journey lift entirely, leaving her light and open to the future. She walked away from the past, stepping into a world full of hope, resilience, and new beginnings. She knew Lucas's love would remain a part of her, guiding her forward, and she was ready to embrace whatever life had in store. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us create more content like this for you. We'd love to hear from you. What part of this story impacted you the most? Was it Marina's resilience, the suspense, or perhaps the final sense of closure? Let us know in the comments. And while you're here, we'd love your input on what stories you'd like to see next. Whether it's more mysteries, heartwarming tales, or thrilling adventures, share your ideas with us below. Your suggestions shape the content we create, so don't hold back. Thanks for watching, and we can't wait to dive into more stories with you.